Welcome to the Unique Bilingual State Podcast, a podcast recorded by Defining Moments Canada in the context of the Unique Bilingual State Project, which explores 250 years of institutional French-English bilingualism in all of its evolving complexity, from the Quebec Act to the present day, within the broader context of language use in Canada. Each English language episode is hosted by Anna Goldsworthy, Director of Programming and Curation at Defining Moments Canada, and features conversations with Serge Dupuis, a Franco-Ontarian historian, author of 3 books and over 30 articles that mostly deal with Francophone communities in Canada. In this first episode, Anna and Serge discuss Regulation 17, which was in effect in Ontario from 1912 to 1927.
So thank you, Serge, for being here, and to listeners for joining us. Today, we are talking about Regulation 17 as part of Defining Moments Canada's project, A Unique Bilingual State, 250 Years of Bilingualism in Canada. We are joined by Serge Dupuis, who is a subject expert and will walk us through this historically defining moment. So Serge, to begin, why don't you explain for us what is Regulation 17?
Regulation 17 was a government directive, an Ontario provincial government directive that prohibited the use of another language than English beyond grade 2. It was adopted on June 25th, 1912, and it was suspended on November 1st, 1927, which means it existed for 15 years in Ontario publicly funded schools. That is the public school system that was unofficially Protestant, and the separate school system that was Catholic, that was partially funded by tax dollars, and that taught mostly in English, but in a lot of areas it taught in French. And in some areas, there was also teaching in Gaelic and German, although that had been pretty much phased out by the end of the 19th century. So you had really 2 kind of religious systems in Ontario and 2 linguistic systems in Ontario at the beginning of the 20th century.
Wonderful. That's really fascinating. I find it particularly interesting that I think a lot of our modern understandings and views about life and society, people can oftentimes overlook the impact or the weight that religion had on the day-to-day, and even to a grander scale, to provincial or even national legislation at the time. So religion was obviously very much part of the social fibers that made up the communities of those times, which is very, very interesting and very pertinent to the subject at hand. But with that, I'd like to ask for you to explore some more of that contextual history behind Regulation 17. How did this law or this regulation come into be, and what were some of the socio-political or even financial causes for it?
Well, schools and what we used to call grammar schools were opened up by parents and communities at the beginning of the 20th century. And these schools tended to reflect local values. That is, religious values, socioeconomic needs, as well as the linguistic makeup of the area. And most of Ontario is rural at the time, which means that it reflected even public schools reflected the Protestant denomination of the area. They taught in English because most migrants by the early 19th century in Ontario were British or American, and therefore they spoke English, or in the case of the Irish, they had been anglicized. There was that system, and in areas where French Canadians migrated to, that is the border regions of Eastern Ontario, Prescott, Russell, Glengarry counties, as well as the Northeast, the districts of Nipissing, Sudbury, Temiskaming. Those areas were colonized by French Canadians who were Catholics, and they tended to erect separate schools, that is, schools that were denominational and that taught in French at the primary level. And this was tolerated and seen as normal during the time of the United Canadas, that is between 1841 and 1866. where what is Quebec and Ontario today formed a single colony before Confederation. So Egerton Ryerson, who was the superintendent of education, saw this as entirely normal that you would have English-speaking Protestant schools in Quebec and that you'd have separate Catholic schools that taught in French in Ontario. The 1867 British North America Act, that's also called the Constitution, that brought Confederation in 1867, protected religious schooling rights only. Now, that was an arrangement that worked out for Quebec Protestants, who were almost all of them Anglophone. There were very few French-speaking Protestants, and if so, they tend to go to the English Protestant school. It was a little bit more complicated for Irish Catholics, who were a minority within the separate French language school boards. But you essentially had two types of school boards: the minority for the Protestant and Anglophone minority, and the majority French Francophone. Things got more complicated, though, in Ontario, because you had the public school that was essentially Protestant and English speaking, and then you had the separate schools where you had a variety of situations, and that situation and the context moved a lot in those years. French Canadians were the overwhelming majority of Catholics in Ontario in the middle of the 19th century. They became a minority in South Central Ontario quite quickly, though, with the migration of Irish refugees and also Italian and Eastern European populations. So French Canadians became a minority in those local separate school boards. In the East and the Northeast, however, there were migrants of Irish Catholics, but they tended not to migrate to the same regions as French Canadians, which meant that French Canadians were a majority in their local separate school boards. The rural localities tended to be quite homogenous or become quite rapidly French Canadian because the families of Catholics were larger than those of Protestants, which meant that Eastern Ontario, that was colonized by some Scottish and English migrants at the early 19th century, quickly became majority French Canadian in the middle of the 19th century. So it brought some tensions, but a school system developed. And the fact that Ontario was governed by the Liberal Party from 1867 to 1905 meant that they respected the letter of the Constitution, but also its spirit. And its spirit in the mind of Liberals was that we would have a system that was flexible, that would recognize local values, and this was seen as a form of generosity of British imperialism at the time, that British identity could be flexible and include religious minorities and linguistic minorities. And we often refer to the case of South Africa, for example, before apartheid, as an example of pluriculturalism and multilingualism, and that being a defining aspect of the British Empire. So that tended to hold for the 19th century. But as I said, religious rights were protected by the Constitution in schooling, not linguistic ones. They aligned almost perfectly for Quebec, but did not align perfectly for Ontario. And that would cause problems for those who saw these constitutional protections as the law and the letter of the law, and that the spirit was not something we agreed on, and that we needed to return to the strict law of the land, which tended to be the position that conservative governments took provincially in New Brunswick and Manitoba in the late 19th century, and when James Whitney was elected in Ontario in 1905.
That's fascinating. So with all that contextual history, then Regulation 17 gets passed or issued in 1912, and then subsequently amended again in 1913. Can you kind of go into what the lived experience as a result of or in response to Regulation 17 would have been, and how French people would have felt about it, how Anglophones would have felt about it, and how it kind of changed their day-to-day, if at all?
Right. So there are a variety of reactions and a variety of levels of implementation of Regulation 17. We should mention that because the federal government did at that time invalidate measures taken by provinces that were seen as unconstitutional, the Conservatives in Ontario decided to wait for the defeat of Wilfrid Laurier at the federal government in 1911 before it would strike its Regulation 17, because Wilfrid Laurier had intervened in the Manitoba schooling crisis in the 1890s, and the Liberal government of Alexander Mackenzie had also intervened in the New Brunswick crisis in the 1870s. So they decided to wait it out until they had conservative governments in Ottawa and Toronto. They reacted to pressure from the Orangemen that were racist, francophobe, pro-Protestant, anti-Catholic militant group at the time. They also reacted to what they were calling the French-Canadian invasion of Eastern and Northeastern Ontario, where French Canadians were becoming the majority. So Quebec was kind of spilling over into Ontario. And that was seen as, breaking the 1867 Pact in a certain way. We had drawn that border on the Ottawa River in order for French Canadians and English Canadians to stop annoying each other, as they did during the United Canada, and that they could manage their local affairs, but have a federal government in which they could deal with common matters. And French Canadians in Quebec tended to subscribe to this idea too, that they wanted their own provincial government, and that French Canadian minorities outside of Quebec would be served mostly by the institutions of the Catholic Church. That is the parish, hospitals, colleges, schools, school boards, so that this institutional network would serve to survive and prolong the French Canadian experience, and that French Canadians could be at home everywhere in the colony. If Anglo-Protestants had had their own school boards, their own colleges, they even had a university, then the opposite should exist in the other colonies, or the other provinces, should I say. And that didn't quite work out. So they were also pushed by Irish Catholics who had lost the English, the Gaelic language, that had transitioned to English, and that sought to preserve mostly, and above all, the right to equitable funding for Catholic separate schools, that the French Canadians should just accept that within the British Empire, you're going to be assimilated. This is what the British do. They're letting us have minority religious rights. We should just be happy with this. And some French Canadians went along with that logic. In southwestern Ontario, for example, where the Canadiens had been there often for a few generations, they were bilingual. They were at ease in Ontario. They didn't visit Quebec anymore. They hardly had family over there. They tended to see Regulation 17 as a good thing. It'll improve the teaching of English. Our kids are going to have to be Anglophones anyways. So let's just accept this. That created conflict, however, in the Southwest with French Canadians who had arrived more recently, those who were born in Quebec or those who had parents who were born in Quebec, who had family there, and who were told that Canada was a pact between two peoples, and that French Canadians had rights in Canada. And they tended to be the most militant resistance of Regulation 17. Now, we should add that they had an Irish bishop, Monsignor Michael Fallon, who actually proclaimed a version of Regulation 17 in his diocese's schools in 1910. So it was already in effect in the London diocese when Regulation 17 came about. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the separate schools of Ottawa. The board was majority French Canadian. It's the federal capital, and therefore the meeting of two peoples. It's on the border with Quebec. A lot of French Canadians there lived in majority neighborhoods. A lot of them had family in Quebec. A lot of them had arrived from the province recently, and they saw this as an aberration of their fundamental rights. And they decided that they could go without provincial funding. At that time, about 2/3 of school funding was raised locally through property taxes, and about 1/3 came from provincial grants. So they could still operate schools even if they lost provincial funding, which was the threat that was taken actually by Regulation 18 that was adopted the later year, where they said, well, we could take away your provincial funding and we could eliminate and invalidate a school board election and therefore name our own school trustees to the boards if you don't conform. And they tried to do that, actually. And then the court kind of said that the province couldn't do that, that was unconstitutional. So the schools of Ottawa resisted, often with teachers not being paid and or paid little. And they resisted for 15 years, did not apply the Regulation 17. You have a lot of areas where it was between those two extremes, the kind of submission, passive submission of old Canadian populations in southwestern Ontario and the fierce resistance of French Canadians in Ottawa. Most schools tended to find themselves somewhere between the two. The anecdote that's mostly told amongst Franco-Ontarians and from the memory of, for example, the generation of my grandparents that came right after Regulation 17. My grandmother was instructed in a school that her grandfather built right after Regulation 17. They tended to talk about the passive resistance that Franco-Ontarians engaged in. That is, that they would have English language books that they take out when inspectors visited the schools in order to evaluate whether teaching was being done in French or in English. They would speak to each other in English during those visits, and then they would put all of that away and continue teaching in French. That's the story that's told most frequently in popular memory. The history of that is a little bit trickier. What it seems is that you do have schools where the teachers and pupils don't have the ability to teach in or be taught in English, and they would lose provincial grants due to the fact that they had stayed too French. We need to note that in 1911, 60% of Ontario's French Canadians were unilingual francophones. It's not like today where 98, 99% speak English. The majority were unilingual French speaking because they tended either to come from Quebec or be brought up in homogenous rural areas of the East and the Northeast. So you really had different populations to which this regulation applied. And the other thing, so often they lost grants because of that, because of the fact that they couldn't learn in English or couldn't teach in that language. And you had others in urban areas that tended to fold or find a way to keep provincial grants. Like in Sudbury, half the schools were conforming, according to some evaluations. But they had created conforming schools with separate classes for French Canadians. So again, they found creative ways to kind of work around this. That doesn't mean that they didn't resist, because I mean, they founded the Oblate Fathers founded Le Droit, the province's still the province's only French language daily in 1913 as an instrument for the resistance. They tended to work harder to elect French Canadian councillors so that Regulation 17 wouldn't be applied. And if we needed to summarize this in one sentence, we could say that in the areas where French Canadians had a majority on the separate school board, Regulation 17 was not applied or very rarely applied. Where they were in the minority, ultimately they had to assimilate and tolerate what some would call today cultural genocide, because they were trying to wipe out the language. They thought that it was okay if it became a second language, but you had to integrate like other immigrants. And French Canadians argued that they weren't immigrants, that they were actually there before the British, and therefore they had certain historical rights because they were there before the state. But I think in the Anglophone psyche, it tended to be that French Canadians had been conquered, and therefore anything that they got was a concession, not a right. And if we decided to take it away, then the legislator could do so. When Franco-Ontarians contested Regulation 17 in the Ontario Supreme Court, that is pretty much what the judge said, the Article 93 of the Constitution and teaching in French, it's in the nature of a concession. It's not a right. And therefore, you kind of have to comply with this. So there was a lot of resistance in the early years. And then there was the Great War in the backdrop, and that tended to calm things down. But Regulation 17 was still in the books. All of that resistance in 1913, 14, 15, 16 did not bring any change in government policy.
Excellent. I'm glad you touched on the point of a cultural genocide, because that's a really interesting perspective that you had spoken about on the French version of this podcast. So I was wondering if you would tread more carefully on the English side of things, but I'm happy that you didn't, and that you used the same verbiage that you used on the French side.
Yeah, I try not to speak out of both sides of my mouth. So to say the same things in English and in French, you can use different words sometimes because the equivalent term doesn't have the same meaning or the same connotation.
Mhm.
But I mean, you're trying to wipe out a language and therefore a political community. So how do you call that? The deportation of Acadians. How do you call that?
Mhm.
The forcible removal of people. I don't know that we call that a crime against humanity. That
It's interesting because you've never, like, from an Ontario perspective or even from a Toronto perspective, that was never presented to us in that lens. But when you explain it exactly as you just did, that's the exact definition. So what else would you call it, right? And so luckily the French persevered.
yeah, well, and they were stubborn in a way, and they were definitely deemed unreasonable. And even the Vatican, when the Vatican intervened in 1916 and 1918 twice, they kind of told French Canadians that, you know what, the Ontario government has a right or is right to expect that you learn English and that you need to do it in their province. And Irish Catholics, well, stop using the church as a political tool. You can have your own battles of language if you want, and if you want to try to wipe out French with your British colonizers, then go ahead. But that's not a religious project. That's a political one. So keep the church out of it. And that the Vatican's directives also kind of tended to calm Catholics, because that was essentially God was talking to you when the Pope said something in 1916 and 1918. Today we tend to relativize those things as the political institution, but in those days, if the Pope told you to calm down, as he did, well, people like Henri Bourassa, who was very engaged in Regulation 17 and the resistance to it in the 1910s, became much more religious and cautious, and his nationalist leanings were evacuated in the 1920s. Not all French Canadians did this, but those who were very religious tend to listen and said, well, if we have to, be less nationalist, then because the church says so, then we'll do it. It's also been seen as the beginning of a certain break between Catholicism and language, because French Canadians in Ontario were the most militant, were disillusioned by the church's neutrality in a certain way towards this, and even to have Irish Catholics and Irish Catholic bishops working against the interests of its French language citizens. Some became critical of the church and thought that they maybe needed non-denominational institutions in order for them to exist as a political community, and that current began in the 1920s. So we tend to see the separation of church and language as something that really happened between the 1960s and 1980s, but it began in the 1920s, really, where you had separate lay institutions that were set up, often saying that they were of Catholic orientation or something like that, but that were not directly influenced by the church.
What also interests me about this specific time period, and specifically Regulation 17, is that all of this is happening right before and during the First World War, which is an interesting context to kind of also be playing in the background or in the foreground or what have you at the time that this is going on. So my next question to you would be, how does this all play out with the international politics going on? How do French Canadians respond to kind of having to sign up or register for this big national fight, and how does that kind of impact patriotism, if you can even call it that at the time?
Yeah, French Canadians tended to be unenthusiastic to send their sons to protect Britain abroad when they were being oppressed by the Dominion of Canada that was not an independent country yet, right? That argument was often made that you needed to be treated fairly by your country if it was expected that you would go defend it and maybe you lose your life on the battlefield. And the crisis of conscription was mostly occurred in Quebec in 1918. But Regulation 17 had become a national crisis within Canada by then. So it was one of the elements, that was used to argue to maintain voluntary participation in the Great War and to not force it upon people who were being mistreated in their own country. And English Canadians changed too during the Great War, and they sacrificed a lot for Britain in the idea often that they received little in return. It should be mentioned that most volunteers, the majority of volunteers in the Great War, had been born in Britain, in Canada, and therefore there was a link for those who were of recent arrival. Britain was their country. For those who were here for a few generations, it was a foreign country, and therefore the views tended to diverge there. And in the 1920s, there was a movement that was called the Unity League that was brought about by a variety of political figures that wanted to encourage the development of a Canadian identity that was less related and dependent upon British norms and behaviors, and which meant that imperialism that might have been fine for Britain, well, it wasn't for minorities, but anyways, it might have been convenient for them, was maybe not practical, and it maybe caused more problems than solutions for Canada. And that maybe the idea that we had recognized French in the federal parliament and courts, and that French was an official language in Quebec, that maybe we could bring about a little bit more tolerance and honor the idea of a pact of two peoples. Now, it also helped out that the federal government at the time was directed by Mackenzie King, and it is liberal government almost without interruption in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And that meant that baby steps were taken to recognize bilingualism on stamps and within new institutions like CBC, Radio-Canada, and the National Film Board, for example. So it began kind of developing a small place for duality, linguistic duality within the federal government, which meant that the provinces morally should follow suit. Regulation 17 had also become an irritant for Ontario, because when there were meetings between premiers, Quebec premiers would bring it up, saying something like, by the way, we're not closing the Protestant school boards or closing McGill or all those institutions. We haven't done anything to harm them. This Regulation 17 thing is being resisted by your own citizens. It's a threat to national unity. Maybe you should reconsider this. The Conservatives in Ontario had been reelected in 1923. There had been the United Farmers prior to that, which meant they had painted themselves into a corner, and now they needed to walk on the paint, find a way to do it honorably. So they organized a commission, an inquiry by Francis Merchant, who had done the first study, which brought Regulation 17 in 1912, the Judge Scott, who was an Orangeman, and Louis Côté, who was a French-Canadian school inspector. And they visited most, if not all, of the province's primary bilingual schools, and ultimately determined that Regulation 17 was not helping any way. That if you didn't teach pupils in their mother tongue, they weren't learning as quickly, or they had trouble at school, or often they quit. Because you have to remember, most people didn't continue to grade 8 in those days, especially the boys. So if the pupils didn't understand what was being said, or performed poorly, then they would go work on the farm instead. So they determined that the French Canadians had actually worked on a bunch of things that had developed the Ottawa Pedagogical School to offer a teacher's certificate that was similar to what was offered in English at the Toronto Normal School since 1846. They had hired more teachers that had certain qualifications. The pedagogical program had been developed in order to teach history and language and English as a second language. And they were performing pretty well, even the schools that didn't respect Regulation 17, and therefore that it was kind of a solution in search of a problem, when the problem was actually the fact that Ontario didn't offer, prior to 1923, training to French Canadian teachers, and didn't offer sufficient resources to separate schools so that they could have access to quality education. So they recommended that Regulation 17 be suspended, and that's what the government of Howard Ferguson did in November 1927.
So we've covered a lot of history around Regulation 17 and its immediate impact and how it was felt immediately. And you've spoke about a lot of an immense amount of pressure, an immense amount of heated responses in response to Regulation 17. So my final question for you, Serge, is how does the story end? And what is the final, I guess, outcome of Regulation 17? And what are some contemporary connections to Regulation 17?
It was it was half of a victory, because although we didn't forbid the teaching of English or French from grade 3 on, there was still the expectation that pupils would transition to English learning by the end of their primary studies, because Ontario only had publicly funded high schools at the time. In 1927, they introduced a course that was called Special French, which meant it was a language course for mother tongue French speakers. So that was offered in Eastern and Northeastern Ontario, for example, in high schools in areas where you had a significant French Canadian population. But ultimately, it kept French Canadians in the margins. So French Canadians continued to be poorly trained in Ontario schools because they didn't have access to secondary education. The elite did, because there were French Canadian colleges where you had to pay tuition fees, or if you were particularly bright, you could get a scholarship. But those colleges for boys and girls in some areas were reserved to a certain elite. A minority of the population could go to these private schools. Most kids quit school prior to grade 8, either because they had to work on a farm or because the local high school, if you're in a rural area, was quite far away, and you had brothers and sisters, in the case of girls, for example, to take care of. So most quit at grade 8. Both of my grandmothers quit at grade 8, for example, because there were no viable secondary options to them. There was also a third option, the high school, that some frequented, but you had to be quite bilingual and really at ease in English, which wasn't the case of most kids in rural areas, which meant they often quit before even finishing their first year. And you can look at a yearbook at Sheridan Technical School, for example, in Sudbury, 1963, and you can see that in grade 9, half of the enrollment is French Canadian, or has a French Canadian name. And by grade 12, there may be 10%. Most of them have dropped off because this wasn't working out. My grandfather went to Collège Sacré-Cœur until grade 12, attempted to do his grade 13 at Sturgeon Falls High School, but quit before the year was finished because there was no accommodation, no adaptation. The expectation was that you would either succeed like Anglophone students or you would fail. And there was quite a bit of intolerance too in some areas towards their presence in these institutions. So that world existed between 1927 and, let's say, the early 1960s. What happened in the 1960s was that French language colleges started having problems. The enrollment was growing, but the religious vocations were declining, which meant that you had fewer priests and nuns teaching in these classes, and hiring a layperson, often in high school men at those times, and providers, meant that you had to pay them a salary instead of a pension. Much more expensive. And a lot of these colleges had $1 million deficits in 1960s dollars. So that's worth 10 times more today. And most of them shut their doors between 1962 and 1967. Now, the Franco-Ontarian militant organizations like the Association Canadienne d'Éducation d'Ontario, ACFEO, asked many times to extend funding to separate secondary schools. But the government always refused, under the pretext that if they gave it to French Canadians, they would need to give it to Irish Catholics also, who also had a network of private colleges, and that they sought to invest public funds in the public school system. What they hadn't thought about at that time, but ended up revealing itself as a solution, especially as French Canada was living through the Quiet Revolution and another national unity crisis. John Robarts, the Premier of Ontario, thought, well, maybe we could recognize, if we're not recognizing funding for Catholic high schools, maybe we could create French language public high schools, which was not an ideal solution because the French language system was almost completely separate and these colleges were closing. So it was a solution that was imperfect and arriving about 5 to 10 years too late. Because most of the colleges didn't exist. So you had a bunch of French Canadians who went to high school. They tried to accommodate them by offering geography and history in French from 1965 onwards, but that was insufficient too. So what happened with that offer, with Bills 140 and 141, they ended up getting a French language secondary schools. So the few colleges that had stayed open, some transitioned and became public schools. But in a lot of areas, you had to build new high schools, and that brought about a bunch of new schooling crises that we'll be talking about in the next episode.
Thank you very much for that, Serge. You almost took away my concluding sentence there, but I'll repeat it regardless. So with these types of histories, people oftentimes, and it's taught this way a lot in Ontario, that these histories are just moments in the past and that they have no real bearing on today. But I think you did a wonderful job at explaining not only the story at large, but also explaining its impact on bilingualism in Ontario today and its impact on French preservation in Canada as a whole. So thank you very much, Serge, for walking us through this history today. And we will reconvene, as Serge teased earlier, on another episode to talk about other topics related to French language education laws and definitional moments of bilingualism in Canada.
All right. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Serge.
Thank you, Anna and Serge, for this very interesting conversation about Regulation 17 in Ontario. This podcast episode is recorded as part of the podcast series in which Anna and Serge will have multiple conversations about multiple different laws or events that affected Francophone communities in Ontario and elsewhere in Canada. It will also feature partner articles and lots of other resources in the Unique Bilingual State Project page on Defining Moments Canada's website. Please check it out and stay tuned for future episodes.